and Dominic Steele, and pastorally leading in the vaccination space. Our guests John McClean, Galea and Phillip Jensen. Background for our international audience: until a month ago, Australia was really on a slow stroll in relation to vaccines. When compared with America or Great Britain, percentage-wise, here very few people were vaccinated. In this country, there hasn't been enough vaccination to go round, and until recently, because the borders had been closed and there'd been little or no COVID in the community, there wasn't a sense of urgency. But that's all changed with the advent of Delta. As we go to air in Sydney and Brisbane, both those cities are in lockdown, and Sydney is expected to stay in lockdown for at least another 4 weeks. And for this city, Sydney, it's really hard to see a way out without a dramatic increase in the percentage of the population being vaccinated. What part should the Christian leader play? My default as a Christian leader has been to stay quiet on issues that aren't clearly mandated in Scripture. So my going in position 10 weeks ago when I got my first AstraZeneca shot was not to say anything. But increasingly, Christian ministers are being pressured to lead in this space. To discuss that, John McClean is Vice Principal and Ethics Lecturer at Sydney's Presbyterian Christ College. Phillip Jensen, the former Anglican Dean of Sydney and now leads Two Ways Ministries, and Galea pastors the influential MBM Anglican Church in the COVID hotspot area in Western Sydney. Ray, if we could start with you and your pastor's heart on this. You found the congregation and the staff team divided on this issue.
Yeah, so one of my staff thought we needed to lead in this direction, and it jarred me. And I thought, let's take it to the staff, see what they're thinking. And I think he was assuming, and maybe I did too, that we all would have a common mind on it. And all of a sudden, we realised what we were hearing in the congregation was what we were even experiencing in staff, to a greater or lesser extent, but with less venom and more grace.
What's going on in the population of your church community in terms of attitudes to vaccination?
Look, my gut feeling is it probably reflects demographic differences. So because we've got a bit of a breadth, then you'll have a breadth of attitude towards the scientific endeavour, government. Who you're listening to tends not to be the Herald, the Australian and the Drum. It's, more likely, Alan Jones, Ray Hadley and the Telegraph. And so you'll get a different perspective. And with that, the algorithms of, the University of Facebook and Google.
John McClean, how should a Christian leader approach the topic? What's your advice to Ray?
Wow. So I'm really interested to hear a bit more from Ray about what the kind of arguments were or the views were in his staff team, without naming names. I'm hoping we'll hear a bit more detail there.
Well, it's not just the staff team. It's not, you haven't got the sort of the conspiratorial edge of the debate. You think you've got just a lot of people who are cautious and aren't generally even anti the vaccination. They would have even had their children vaccinated for other things. In this case, I think the mainstream bell curve, and remember, there's still a smaller percentage of the congregation, I don't want to exaggerate it, but there's still a real part of it. You get the more extreme anti-vaccination position with some conspiratorial thinking, but probably the mainstream in that section of the debate has it been, is it long enough, so whatever the data's saying so far, they're trying to anticipate what it may be. Did the process of getting the vaccines follow the normal length of processes, and then with that, just, hearing other voices that they are sensitive to, that they weight more heavily than perhaps others would.
I think as a starting point, help people to think about the importance of serving the common good is so loving your neighbour, but realising that vaccination, like a lot of other things about the pandemic, is one of those things where a whole lot of individual actions end up coalescing into a total effect that's bigger than the sum of the parts, isn't it? And that's the whole idea of the common good. That'd be probably my starting point, but I think we also want to recognise the struggles or the reasons people have for hesitancy about vaccination, and address them carefully and not put too heavy a burden on people's conscience too directly, but give people a chance to hear the argument for serving their neighbour by taking the vaccine, but also to talk through what their concerns are.
I mean, just on that, it's not whether I'm going to love my neighbour or not, which is exactly the right ethic, the other person-centred ethic. It's the grounds upon which they're making that, applying that principle. And so how much they're weighting the data that, person A would be much more sensitive to submitting to as opposed to person B. Yeah. So, I find everyone's working on a similar framework. They're just that is in terms of the ethic. It's the interpretation of the data from which then to make the decision about whether this vaccine is more loving or less loving, as the case may be. That's the difficulty.
We need to give people opportunities to talk about these things. I don't think anyone's served well by kind of a pontification about it and demanding that everyone agree with the pastor or anything like that. Even if your goal is to convince people, you don't convince people that way. I don't think you convince people by allowing people to express their concerns and talk it through, and protect people's freedom to make their own decisions.
What's the grid for how you think about, as a Christian minister, approaching this topic?
I think one of the underlying issues that Ray's mentioning is that we do live in an era where people have lost confidence and lost trust in government and science and the media. And that's part of the background for those people who are hesitant about vaccines, that's part of the background. And you're not going to address that immediately. And of course, there are reasons for people to be...
And even in defence of that view for a minute, the Deputy Premier of New South Wales described the, the close contact, casual contact system as a lucky dip the other day. And so you've got the Deputy Premier undermining his own government system at this point. And so what's a punter to think at that point?
And not the first time.
I mean, and Ray, one of the things that struck me is, as you were telling me the story of your congregation, I did the little survey of my staff, and really I was thinking, for many of them who are 20-somethings, up until a month ago, the whole issue of vaccination for them has been academic. It's only really been in the last couple of weeks that the governments have been saying you should get AstraZeneca as well. And so it's been a down-the-track thing that I haven't had to address until suddenly now I'm being told you should think about it.
Well, you're being told more than that, aren't you? Quickly, go and get it as quickly as you can is what the government message is.
Phillip Jensen, what's your view?
I think John's right. It's about government and science and journalism that has not served our community well in communication to people to make decisions, and that's been something of a problem for us. But it's also got to do with our culture's fierce individualism, and again, that's why I think putting it in the context of love your neighbour is the right place to put it, because although your congregations may be talking in those kinds of terms, the anti-vax people aren't talking in those terms. They're talking in terms of just crass individualism. It's my choice. I can decide what I want to do or not. The government can't tell me anything, and science can't tell me anything, and I believe the journalists who are against it. We choose which journalists we listen to now. You know what I mean? So I got several strong objections to the journalistic community. I think they have not served us well. They have a philosophy that conflict gives a good story and sells papers. And so what's the conflict in this issue? They have another philosophy which says we've got to speak truth to power because power is corrupt and those in power are corrupt, and we are responsible for showing the corruption of government all the time. And that's the philosophy by which, excuse me, speaking is like this to the ex-journalist, come journalist Dominic, but that's the philosophy journalism is working on in our society. And both those aspects of the philosophy are totally and completely unhelpful when we're in a conflict situation with a virus.
Can I pick up on that point that you made about the worldview clash between the highly individualistic anti-vaxxer and the other person-centredness of the gospel?
Well, it's a bigger issue that goes back centuries. It's the push that we have been experiencing from the Enlightenment onwards. And we now have this sense that my community responsibility is somehow less than my individual conscience. We use the word conscience, but we 9 times out of 10 mean preference. It's not something I'm going to die for. It's just something that I don't like or I don't want. And we will go along with those in authority as long as authority tells us to do the things that we wanted to do anyway. Now, I take it that it is the responsibility of pastors to do as Paul tells Titus to do. That is, I just read to make sure I get it right here, remind them to be submissive to rulers and authorities, to be obedient, to be ready to do every good work. We have a responsibility to teach right submission to authority because, as it says in Romans 13:1, all authorities have been given by God. Now, there's a time to disobey governments, like in Acts chapter 4, but you've got to have a clear word from God that what the government's asking you to do is somehow contrary to the word of God. Well, I don't think this is within cooey of that. And I'm a member of this society. These people, I mean, we're in a much better position than the Roman Empire. I mean, I can elect these people out of power next year or whenever it might be. I mean, I'm allowed to speak freely, like in this conversation. If I wanted to, I can dump on the government and say how stupid they are. Couldn't do that in the Roman Empire. You don't have the choice to vote the emperor. And Paul is writing, and Peter is writing, about being obedient to governments as being of the heart of Christian citizenship. Well, I'm sorry for our Christian brothers and sisters who have been confused by the media and doubting authorities. I think John and Ray are right in what they're saying. There is this confusion abroad, but that's why I think we as pastors have a responsibility to clarify the confusion. I don't think I've got responsibility to explain the science of vaccines or the science of COVID. You know, that's beyond my competence. It's not beyond John McClean's. He's clever. That's beyond my competence, you see. But I do have a responsibility to explain how loving my neighbour means doing what the government tells me to do, unless I have a word from God to say never do that.
But Philip, that's still because you're persuaded of the legitimate interpretation of the conclusion. I'm not denying what you're saying, by the way, your kind of foundational things, but you're dealing with a brother or a sister who's, got in their head, they're persuaded that for whatever reason these things are harmful. It's not just, I know you've got the extreme anti-vaxxers, but there's just that there's still a significant population. You may want to think that they're wrong on their conclusions, but they in their mind have come to a conclusion, or at least agnostic, and therefore it's probably more agnosticism. That's probably where they haven't quite landed absolutely. They're just, I want to wait because, if this is going to cause sterility in my girls, for want of the many other, then I want to hold back and wait till, because it's just been rushed. And so I guess I want to stop I don't want this to be weaponized into another kind of us and them, which has happened over the last few years. And that's the problem. It can easily be weaponized if you're not legitimating at least where they're coming from, even if you might disagree with the foundation which they're saying. Otherwise, we won't hear each other. And that's why I wrote the way I wrote, because it's trying to manage differing opinions, which is a slightly different question. How do we live with the differences so we can actually not dishonour God and divide the church and family?
Yeah, well, John's right in terms of it's not a papal statement we need. It is the patient kindness of sitting down with these people, hearing what their anxieties and worries are about, and providing them with the information to overcome those. So we're talking about two slightly different things. One is, what is the direction we should be going? And secondly is, how do we help our congregation to go in that direction? How we do it will take a lot of time, patience, and kindness for some people.
But it will end up in a conversation about science. That's the whole thing, whichever way you want to look at the weight of the scientific evidence. And that's what takes it outside of my purview then, yeah.
See, I don't think part of the journalistic failure has been to consistently say, following the science is what the politicians are doing, which is right and proper. Right? We don't want to follow religion and other things like that. But in fact, apart from the actual issue of whether this vaccine works or not, nearly everything the government has said, locking down, not speaking to your neighbours, it's exactly what Martin Luther said 500 years ago. It's exactly what the people at AM did up in Derby 400 years ago when they stopped the bubonic plague. We're not doing. Most of it is government issues, not science. Now, the particular of taking this vaccine, yeah, that's got to do with science, but it's also got to do with trusting the scientists, the medical fraternity, and trusting the government. Now, I guess I trust the medical fraternity because I grew up in the age of diphtheria and polio and scarlet fever. And these people have never heard of these things, many of them, because the vaccines worked. And I had no more information about taking those vaccines than I had about taking this vaccine.
No, but you're also the generation that knows about thalidomide as well, and the damage that was done there. So, no, I agree. I can remember the victims of polio. I'm slightly younger than you, marginally, and absolutely. And by the way, a lot of the people who I'm talking about have actually vaccinated their children. So they're not, that's the problem. This debate gets kind of either or. And so you've got the extreme anti-vaxxers who are protesting in the city, who are highly individualistically oriented. You've just got this harder group, this softer group that are just more cautious and agnostic. Yeah.
Yeah. But you need to ask them, what do you know about the science of the vaccines you did take and did give to your children? The basis of knowledge is pretty much the same.
No, well, I think some of them will say they just took longer to go through the process and didn't rush it because So,
John, you look poised to say something there.
Yeah, a few things I wanted to pick up on, which will probably take us in multiple different directions. So one comment I was going to make was, it is a little bit more complicated than obeying the state, because we haven't reached the point, and I hope we won't reach the point where we're being directed by the state. It's actually a kind of public health campaign encouraging us to do something. So it doesn't quite come to the point of being asked to obey the government, which does actually increase the question about the trust. Do I trust the government to encourage me to do something that's really going to be helpful for me? The other kind of background issue I think that's interesting is that it's an interesting conflict between the two Enlightenment ways of thinking about ethics: utilitarianism on the one hand and autonomy on the other. And in one sense, that at a kind of ethical theory level, that's what the clash is between people saying, I have the right to determine how I live and make my own decisions about my own body, which is one strong theme in Western culture. But the other strong theme in Western culture is we have to work out what's best for the majority. And that's the way we do public policy. And this is just a classic issue of the two clashing. That doesn't solve it. It's just kind of, I think it helps to kind of frame the thinking or help you understand a bit what's going on in the background. The other thing I was just going to say was just helpful perhaps to remember the statistics. It looks like in New South Wales at present, you've got about 10% of the population who are vaccine hesitant and about 5% who are resistant and some type of anti-vaccination position. And presumably that's roughly what we'll find in our churches, probably varying a bit, a bit around the suburbs.
Can I go back to John's point, which is a good one, on the government's direction to take this vaccine? I agree with him. The government hasn't said you must, and it would be a bad thing if the government did, and especially as I don't think they can, because I think there are certain medical conditions under which people rightly shouldn't be taking these things, right? And so what they've said is, we want you to go to your GP and, get the advice to take it or not. I don't think they can go any further than that without creating medical problems. But when the government says, we want you to do this, and we want you to do it now, and we want you to do it quickly, and here are the reasons, I think you should obey what the government says. I don't think I have to wait till the government passes a law saying that, I'll be imprisoned if I don't. However, the government did say not to go into big crowds, and big crowds gathered. But that's a slightly different issue there.
But the government did, yes, that was not just the government advice, was it? That was the direction. And I think, what you just said about the government, advice being go and speak to your GP is probably a key element in our pastoral approach as well to people in the congregation who are nervous, that pastors shouldn't put themselves up as medical experts, but what we should say is, I think as a believer, you do have a responsibility to consider the common good. And I think there's a really strong case that taking the vaccine is the way to care for your neighbour. But you need to go and talk to your GP and get them to talk through with you what it means for you and what your concerns are.
That's the best approach for me because, in fact, the ad on TV that I just saw during the Olympics was start a conversation with your doctor, shifts that kind of therefore, love your neighbour, therefore have the vaccination to love your neighbour. Why don't you start a conversation with the doctor? Because you normally trust him or her with your body and your health. 95% of us would do that. So it's the voice is coming from someone who's more qualified and experienced and can speak to the data. It's interesting, after the article, one of the guys in my church said to me, Ray, I was going to go and protest in the last week, but I realised that wasn't the right thing to do. And then he said, I'm starting to think a bit more positively about vaccination. And I'm just wondering, we've got to take the heat out. Sorry, I guess I'm talking about my particular context. The more we ramp it up, you know what it's like. Everyone gets on the back foot and more defensive and no one's listening. Yeah, and it tends not to allow, it's just not good for Christians to do that and the pressure they're putting on it. I'm seeing families, couples, just quite tense, as well as members of the congregation kind of losing it on Facebook. And we've got, for me, and I think there's two things here. There's the wisdom of the issue itself. Then there's the wisdom of the particular pastor in his particular church and how he's managing that. Because I think, in some congregations, it's just not an issue. It's kind of like there's a common view, go for it. But we're juggling a few more balls where we are, and I've got to be more respectful. I think that's right anyway, but to allow the conversation and, God willing, get people to honour the government, as Philip's saying, avoid civil unrest and not divide the church on something that's not a gospel issue, though a very important one.
But it's the how-to you're talking about there, of which you're absolutely right. And I think you most likely have to do it person by person almost. It's not one of those issues that really is so much the pulpit as the personal work.
Yep. I think that's a helpful point, the public versus the private, and what you're stating, yeah.
As you rightly say, in some congregations and others, there are some congregations you use it from the pulpit and just say, go and get vaccinated. This is, the way to love your neighbour. But you're right, in certain congregations, it's been more difficult.
I suspect that, I often say people respond to consequences more than words, and the lockdown, travel bans, all of a sudden everyone's getting vaccinated and all the talk in the world, which is great, but all of a sudden we're fundamentally discovering my need for freedom is actually really setting the agenda, unfortunately.
And this is exactly the statistics. In New South Wales, hesitancy was 35% at the end of May, and it's down to 15% now, which is, that's a pretty remarkable change in public opinion in a couple of months.
Really?
This is the figures from this week. Yeah. Dominic, I wonder if it's worth looking down the track a little bit, though. I think it's at least worth wondering about what might happen about an expectation of people showing proof of vaccination to go to public gatherings. I wouldn't surprise me if that comes in with sporting events, theatre.
Church.
Well, that's the question then, isn't it? Church. And the health authorities have been nervous about churches as spreading events. And I think for some good reason. Like when I go to the theatre, I don't go around and shake hands with everyone else who's there and give them a hug. But actually, that's what we do at church. We hang out with each other a lot. So I'm not, whether I don't again expect that the government would require churches to have proof of vaccination, but I can imagine some social pressure.
I mean, that's a really interesting discussion, and I feel much warmer about the idea of us having a discussion about what we want to do than I would about the government telling me what to do in terms of our church. But what would you suggest? What might you do, Ray? Could you imagine having a vaccination passport at checking at the door of NBM?
Oh, dear. At the beginning of NBM's history, when we were a group of about 20, there was, I'm just trying to protect all the parties involved, but there was a family that didn't vaccinate. Their children had whooping cough. My child who was vaccinated had it. It was a really delicate matter, and people were wanting me to be really upset with the people, and I had to manage how they perceive those people, that they were trying to, within their own framework, thinking that, herd immunity or whatever, the natural response of the body to the whooping cough should have been the solution. So they weren't there to harm and me. We did have to keep them separate until the whooping cough finished in their family because they still wanted to come. But apart from that, it's interesting. It's not like this is the first time it's happened. It happened at the very beginning when we were really particularly fragile and managing love in that. Look, I couldn't tell you off the top of my head. I suspect if the government said it, we'd follow that. We'd probably have different congregations then, wouldn't we? But if they didn't, I probably wouldn't go down that road. But I, to be honest, I've said that. I haven't given it much thought.
And I mean, one scenario, of course, is if it becomes something that they're doing at sporting stadiums and they're doing at theatres and cinemas and things like that, that there'll be an expectation in congregations. It won't be the government. It'll be congregation members saying, oh, we should do the same thing. Everyone, just like everyone checks in with their QR code now. So I think that will be a real pastoral issue. I'd certainly want to protect people's conscience if it's genuinely a matter of conscience. But I think this is one of the troubles with this whole topic is it really is difficult to work out, is this really a matter of conscience? I mean, Philip was saying earlier, it's not really a matter of conscience unless you're really ready to die for it. That's a pretty high bar to have to cross, and
It's the bar we're called to.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. But whether it's the bar that it has to reach that point before I protect it for someone else,
What's your take on the idea of vaccination passport for church, Philip?
It's great to hear John, the wisdom he's got in these things. He's right, I'm sure. Once it becomes, like the QR codes, I now have to carry my phone everywhere I go because of QR codes, etc. And so once it becomes normal in society, then churches will find it completely normal too. We already do some protection. Most of our churches will not serve nuts or any nut products because of, there's a minority group who have nut allergies. There's a lot of conferences these days I go to. There's always special diet people on the side. So I don't think it will be extraordinarily different to that. The real difference is because people will be choosing not to vaccinate. And if that makes it slightly different to all those other cases, doesn't it? And so it could be difficult, I think. However, I'm with Ray. You know, when whooping cough, the what's that terrible meningococcal one that's been around? You know, people are pretty intolerant of others who have chosen not to vaccinate and then affected their children. That's an unpleasant decision.
I imagine that most people will be quite accepting of the fact that, oh, if I'm not well, I shouldn't come to church because I'm not vaccinated, I'm not well, it could be COVID, I won't go. But I can imagine people will be far more upset if I'm perfectly well. There's nothing wrong with me. I just have chosen not to be vaccinated. You've got no reason to think that I'm likely to infect anyone, but you're telling me unless I can show that I've been vaccinated, I can't come into church. I think that'll be the point of dispute and upset.
Like the flu, we will still be catching COVID from each other, whether we're vaccinated or not. If I've understood it correctly, I may have misunderstood that. It's just that if we're vaccinated, we're less likely we'll get it with a less impact.
And probably get it from others less, because there'll be a less disease load, so you won't spread as much, but you can still spread.
Yeah, and so I'm not sure whether we need to go to the passport level. Though I wouldn't want to sit in a plane from here to England with, people who may be having the disease. That would be, just locked up in an air-conditioned tube for 24 hours. That would be pretty awful, wouldn't it?
Especially the older we get, Philip.
Yes, you notice the oldest person here is the fiercest on this subject.
Thanks so much for talking to us. My guests on The Pastor's Heart, Phillip Jensen, the former Anglican Dean of Sydney, John McClean, the Vice Principal and in fact Acting Principal of Christ College, the Presbyterian College in Sydney, and Ray Galea, the Senior Pastor of MBM, Rooty Hill. We'll look forward to your company on The Pastor's Heart next week. Thanks for joining us.